So one aspect of the war that really changed society was how they paid for it, and the cost can be racked up in different ways. Obviously, there was the cost of manpower and the cost to society, and in a lot of ways it couldn't be calculated, but in some ways it could. So, in one sense, France and Belgium paid the largest costs in that they suffered the most physical destruction to their productive areas. For France, this was particularly devastating in that northern area of France tends to be one of their more productive areas. So that was terrible. Belgium obviously paid one of the worst prices of being the first invaded and then occupied for so long. Other costs were to kind of the idealism and the values that people held and that the countries held. So countries that had once prided themselves on being bastions of freedom, being economically prosperous, they kind of threw that all in the toilet in order to prosecute the war. So Germany, for example, had been moving towards increased liberalization for a good 70 years. Liberalization with a small L, meaning more democracy, more rights for the average people, and so forth. And they had been Germany had been a monarchy and had been pretty much an absolutist monarchy before 1848, and then it engaged in a number of reforms during the Bismarck years after the revolutions of 1848. And by the 20th century, I mean, the Reichstag it was a legislature that didn't have a whole lot of power, but it did give people at least some kind of a voice. And by the middle or by the beginning of World War One, I mean, that was pretty much over. The Reichstag became more of just a rubber stamp body and not really representative. And by 1917, what had happened was any remnants of kind of increased democratic reforms in Germany went by the wayside or just were ignored in favor of trying to prosecute the war. And that was illustrated by the kind of de facto takeover. So the major generals, the primary generals in Germany, just took over the government without really taking it over, if that makes sense. They just became, when they became the supreme commanders of the military, they also became supreme commanders of the country just kind of by default. So Erich Ludendorff and Paul von Hindenburg, who had been the major commanders in the Eastern Front and then took over the Western Front after 1916, they basically became simultaneously the dictators of Germany from 1917 to 1918 when the government fell apart. So after the war ended. Another cost was how much they were willing to take away anybody's rights. Germany went the furthest in terms of a draft or conscription. Late in 1916, they approved what was called an auxiliary service law, which Ludendorff felt didn't even go far enough. Ludendorff wanted to go further than this. It put every person in Germany, every man from ages 16 to 60, eligible for the draft, and so eligible to be called up for military service. And Ludendorff actually wanted to go further. He wanted to put women in eligible for the draft. They wouldn't necessarily be drafted for the front, but they would be drafted to serve in war industries, service support personnel. He wanted to draft the entire country to fight the war effort, like a very, just an incredible theory of total war. So Ludendorff and Hindenburg kind of displaced the Kaiser. The Kaiser became a figurehead, and then eventually he had to run away from Germany in disgrace. Germany had the most trouble financially paying for the war. But the truth was, and if you ask, how oh, and Britain also did conscription too. So all the belligerent powers are basically calling on their people to engage in this enormous sacrifice, and increasingly people are asking why. What's the point if we can't win? There were production quotas set for the economy. Sometimes those quotas were met, sometimes they were not, which gives rise to a rather key question is, okay, they're paying for it in all this way. How did they actually pay the financial cost of the war? And the answer essentially is they didn't pay for it financially. When push comes to shove, it kind of reveals, when you have national or international crises, it kind of reveals that our monetary economics, and we're going through something like this now with COVID, your monetary economics start to take a back seat to kind of the more pressing issues. And the pressing issue became winning the war, and it really didn't matter how you paid for it, and so they just did not pay for it. This had been foreseen, and it was actually part of the reasoning, we didn't read this part of the 1913 book, but before the war, there were various thinkers who argued there's no way a great power war can be sustained financially. And one of those was by a Russian writer named Ivan Bloch, and he basically wrote a series of books that said any kind of great power war would not be would be a war of not fighting but famine, and the cost would be to the entire society. And it would not only mean killing people, it would mean bankrupting the country, and bankrupting it in a total sense. So you fought total war, and you would also bankrupt it totally, meaning destroying the social organization of the country, not just the finances of the country, which he ended up being both right and wrong. Another book that came out later by an English writer named Norman Angell, which was a bestseller, argued that there simply wasn't enough money in the economy to prosecute a great power war. And given what the major powers of the world were already spending on their militaries, they couldn't possibly maintain it. And so where both these writers were wrong is that, yes, the costs were insane. It's been calculated the total cost of World War I was about 200 and some $billion, which today inflation can't even adjust properly for values that far back. But $200 to $250 billion in the 19 teens would probably come out to, you can multiply it by about 15 times, more or less. It would come out into the multiple trillions of dollars today, probably equivalent to the United States' GDP today. So, but they didn't even think about that. What happened was the war became kind of a repeating cycle that you could not lose, because to lose it would be to destroy your country, both socially and financially. So you just put more and more into it, and all the countries just took out a ton of debt, and they just didn't worry about where the debt came from. To the extent that they worried about their finances is that if they were printing too much money, they would then sometimes raise taxes in order to kind of absorb the inflation. That was the extent, but they actually didn't even raise taxes that much. They were just basically printing money to pay for the war. And so it kind of gives a lie to our whole theories of monetary economics. The countries that suffered worse financially, so Britain was somewhat more able to at least manage, even though it was bad for Britain financially. Britain was they already couldn't afford the military they had prior to 1914, and the Navy was already costing them way too much to try to maintain their empire. And but Britain at least had some semblance of trying to balance their budgets. The rest of them didn't. And But the British just, they had an advantage that they had the best banks in the world, and that was able to keep finance running. The countries that suffered worst were obviously Austria-Hungary and Russia. The ones that were already on decline didn't have really strong industries. or a strong financial system, and were having to try to maintain this huge military infrastructure, and their country started to fall apart financially. Russia borrowed from everyone, and so this is part of the problem that caused the Russian Revolution, is just all the expense of the war, of their entire country went into the war effort, and there was nothing left for any food or anything. Not only was there no money left for people to buy stuff like food, there wasn't the resource availability because everything was going to the war effort. There wasn't even much being produced for civilians back home, and so they would have these shortages, which caused major unrest. It also, we think that the United States was somehow, the popular notion at the time was the United States was not part of this, and managed to keep out of the financial trouble. But the United States got sucked into it as well. By 1917, the United States economy was totally dependent on all this printed money that was coming out of Europe, that was purchasing all the U.S. industrial goods, and even more importantly, the agricultural goods. So Britain and France's debt printing was basically bankrolling American farmers. And so if you cut that, it would cause the whole economy to collapse. And indeed, the problem was the agricultural economy ended up causing the Great Depression 10 years later, which is going to be a reason for World War II. So what all the belligerents did was take their countries, which had been pretty successful, some of them on the decline like Austria-Hungary, but some of them on the increase like Britain or France, that were pretty prosperous, and you could say their lives were pretty good, and they just flushed it down the toilet because all of it was going into this war effort that by 1917 you then couldn't extricate yourself from, because either to continue or to end the war would have caused an economic collapse by 1917. Either way, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, was the situation. And the United States was the same way. In fact, that was one of the reasons the United States joined the war, was not just because they were upset about the U-boats attacking American shipping, but because for the war to end, especially if Germany were to win the war, would have been financially disastrous for the United States. They could not afford for that to happen.